The Titanic Tragedy. Table of Contents. The birth of the RMS Titanic. 1. The voyage begins. 2. The Ship of Dreams. 3. Lifeboats. 4. Iceberg. 4 to 5. The Titanic sinks. 5 to 7. Rescue. 8. Aftermath. 8 to 9. What happened to the Titanic? The birth of the RMS Titanic. The White Star Line was founded in Liverpool, England, by John Pilkington and Henry Wilson in 1845. It was later purchased by its director, Thomas Henry Ismay. Ismay's son, J. Bruce Ismay, became a partner in the business in 1891. It was J. Bruce Ismay who dreamed up the RMS Titanic in April of 1907. The Titanic's design was finished in 1908, and construction of the ship began in 1909. The RMS Titanic first set sail on April 2, 1912, for its sea trials. It arrived in Southampton, Liverpool, the following day. Above, the Titanic is constructed, 1911. Below, sea trials on April 2, 1912. The voyage begins. Titanic's maiden voyage actually began on April 10, 1912, after accepting the embarkation or boarding of passengers and crew in Southampton. As Titanic left the port, it nearly collided with another steamliner, New York. The two ships only missed each other by about 4 feet. 4 hours later, the Titanic arrived in Cherbourg, a French port, where it collected more passengers. Titanic made one last stop for passengers at Cork Harbour in Queenstown, Ireland, on April 11th before beginning its Atlantic crossing. The next 3 days aboard the Titanic passed without incident as the ship began its intercontinental voyage across the Atlantic Ocean. Above, the Titanic at Southampton prior to departure. Below, at Cork Harbour. The Ship of Dreams. The Titanic offered different accommodations on the ship based on ticket price. First-class passengers sailed in luxurious, spacious rooms. They ate in fine restaurants and enjoyed a gym and swimming pool. Although third-class accommodations were very different from first class, they were much better than those on other ships at that time. Their staterooms, or rooms where guests slept, were tiny, often containing only a sink and bunks. There were only 2 bathtubs for the more than 700 third-class passengers to share. Third-class passengers also had access to a dining hall and public gathering place. Still, most third-class passengers were pleased with the impressively clean accommodations. Left, one of the many first-class staterooms aboard the Titanic. Right, a third-class stateroom with a sink and 2 bunks. Lifeboats. The RMS Titanic held a total of 20 lifeboats, capable of carrying just under 1,200 people. The number of lifeboats on board was actually more than the ship was required to carry by law. Still, if all of the lifeboats were filled to capacity, only half of the people on the Titanic would have fit. Iceberg. On April 14th, Titanic received a number of warnings from other ships nearby about icebergs in the area. Despite the warnings, the ship's captain, Captain Edward Smith, ordered that the Titanic continue on at full speed. Around 11:40 p.m. on the night of April 14th, 1912, Frederick Fleet, a lookout aboard, and I'll continue that in a second. Let's look at the picture. Lifeboats aboard the Titanic were capable of carrying less than half the passengers. Continuing reading, the Titanic spotted an iceberg just ahead in Titanic's path. Fleet alerted officials on the ship. Immediately, First Officer William Murdoch ordered that the ship turn away from the iceberg and the engines be reversed in order to stop the ship. It was too little, too late. The Titanic struck the iceberg, causing a series of holes below the waterline of the ship. The Titanic sinks. Water began to flood the holes caused by the impact of the iceberg. 5 watertight compartments began to fill with water. Soon it became clear that the Titanic was doomed. The ship's crew began notifying passengers to don, or put on life jackets and report to deck. At this time, passengers were not told that the ship was sinking, and many ignored the orders, preferring to remain in their warm rooms rather than be outside in the chilly night air. First class passengers were assisted to deck, while second and third class passengers were merely awoken and ordered to leave their rooms. Sadly, many third class passengers were unable to find their way to safety, either lost in the maze of corridors or blocked from escape due to locked gates. Officers began loading the lifeboats with women and children first. Some men were also put on lifeboats when there were no more women and children waiting at the time. Although the lifeboats were capable of holding 68 people safely, most lifeboats were lowered with only half that number on board, as the crew was afraid of putting too many people on a lifeboat. Had the lifeboats been filled to capacity, an additional 500 people could have been saved. J. Bruce Ismay, chairman of the White Star Line Company, was among those loaded into lifeboats. As the lifeboat evacuation proceeded, distress signals were sent out over radio waves and flares were launched from the ship. Another ship in the Atlantic, the RMS Carpathia, heard the ship's call for aid and headed that way. It would take the RMS Carpathia 4 hours to travel the 58 miles to the Titanic. The crew of the Carpathia put themselves, I'm going to pause and go to the images. The iceberg believed to have been struck by the iceberg believed to have been struck by the Titanic, photo taken on April 15th, 1912. Iceberg, hull, Titanic. As the Titanic struck the iceberg, the hull was not sliced. Instead, the iceberg caused the plates on the side of the ship to buckle and rivets to pop, damaging 5 compartments. The ship was designed to stay afloat with a maximum of 4 compartments flooded. Continuing. In danger. Traveling at dangerous speeds and dodging nearby icebergs to reach the distressed Titanic. At around 2:15 a.m., the ship suddenly began to sink more rapidly. The bow, or front end of the ship, dipped under and water began to pour onto the ship. The angle of the ship increased as the stern, or back of the ship, lifted into the air, exposing the ship's giant propellers. Then the ship began breaking into 2 pieces, and the bow separated from the stern and sank to the bottom of the ocean. The stern bobbed in the water for a few minutes before the back end rose to a vertical angle, straight up and down, and sank into the ocean. Those who remained on the Titanic either jumped into the frigid waters or sank with the ship. Rescue. As hundreds of people entered the frigid waters with the ship, their cries for help were largely ignored by those in nearby lifeboats out of fear that the frantic victims might storm and topple over the lifeboats. Eventually, one lifeboat would return to rescue survivors from the water, but only after waiting until a considerable amount of time had passed. In the end, only 7 people were pulled from the water after the ship sank. Those in lifeboats would wait until around 4:15 for the RMS Carpathia to arrive and take passengers aboard. Some passengers climbed up rope ladders to reach the Carpathia, while others had to be hoisted in slings. By 9 a.m., all surviving passengers were aboard the RMS Carpathia. It would take 3 full days for the Carpathia to reach New York due to icebergs and thick fog. It was then that the public became aware of the depth of the Titanic tragedy. Titanic survivors wait to be rescued. This photograph was taken from the deck of the Carpathia on the morning of April 15th, 1914. Fate of Titanic's passengers by class. Class, people on board, percentage saved. First class, 325, 62%. Second class, 285, 41%. Third class, 706, 25%. Aftermath. As the details of the Titanic's sinking were revealed, the public was outraged. Questions emerged. Why had the ship proceeded at full speed despite the iceberg warnings? Why had the Titanic carried so few lifeboats? Why had J. Bruce Ismay rescued himself while women and children were still aboard? In response to the public's outcry, laws were changed requiring ships to carry enough lifeboats for the number of passengers aboard. Furthermore, the U.S. government passed the Radio Act of 1912 to require that ships leave radio communications on 24 hours a day in order to be able to receive distress calls from nearby ships. By 1913, the United States Coast Guard formed the International Ice Patrol to monitor and report on icebergs in the northern Atlantic Ocean. Glossary: bow, the front of a ship, the forward part of the hull of the boat. Don, to put on clothing, to assume or take on. Embarkation, the boarding of passengers onto a ship. Stateroom, a private compartment on a ship, usually sleeping quarters. Stern, the rear part of a ship, vertical angle, in a position that is straight up and down. Index, accommodations, 3. Captain, C. Smith Edward. Carpathia, 6-8. Cherbourg, 2. Construction, 1. Cork Harbor, 2. Fleet, Frederick, 4. Iceberg, 4. Ismay J. Bruce, 1-6. Ismay Thomas Henry, 1. Lifeboats, 4-6. Liverpool, England, 1-2. Murdoch, William, 5. Queenstown, Ireland, 2. Radioactive 1912, 9. Rescue, 8. Sinking, 567. Smith Edward Captain, 4. Southampton, 1. White Star Line, 16.